What would you do if your own parents forged your signature to take out a massive loan behind your back? That's exactly what happened to me. And when the judge finally spoke, they lost everything they thought was theirs. Before I take you into the details of what happened, I want to pause here, just for a moment. This story wasn't assembled by an algorithm or pulled from thin air. Someone sat with this, word by word, and shaped it with real intention. Every name, every silence, every crack in the wall, it was chosen. So if something here moves you, know that it was meant to. My name is Veradis, and this is a story I never thought I'd have to tell. And since we're already here, at the beginning of something heavy, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments. It always surprises me how far a story can travel. My apartment on the 14th floor didn't look like much from the outside. A modest building in a mid-sized city, the kind of place people drive past without noticing. But inside, everything was mine. Not inherited. Not gifted. Not code-signed mine. The furniture I'd chosen piece by piece over 7 years. The kitchen that smelled like coffee at 6 in the morning and something warm by evening. The silence I had learned to love instead of fear. I was 34 years old when the phone rang and changed everything. But before I get there, you need to understand what I have built and why it mattered so much that someone tried to steal it. I grew up in a home where money was a weapon. Not a resource, not a tool. A weapon. Cortland, my father, held the finances the way some men hold power, tightly, and with the constant suggestion that it could be taken away. He never raised his voice about it. He didn't need to. The implication was always enough. Solvin, my mother, moved through that dynamic with a kind of elegant indifference that I misread for years as grace. It wasn't grace. It was strategy. I left at 22. Not with a dramatic suitcase scene or a slam door. I simply stopped coming back. I finished my degree, took a job in logistics management that paid modestly at first, then better, then very well. I saved with the focus of someone who understood, on a cellular level, what it felt like to be financially dependent on a person who used that dependency as a leash. I never wanted a leash again. Not from a partner, not from a bank, and certainly not from my parents. By the time I was 31, I had a healthy investment portfolio, no consumer debt, a paid-off car, and the beginnings of a real estate position that my financial advisor, a cautious woman, who didn't impress easily, called unusually disciplined for your age. I remember smiling when she said that. I didn't tell her what the discipline had cost me in loneliness, in holidays spent working instead of traveling home, in the slow and deliberate construction of a life that no one else could dismantle. My relationship with Cortland and Solvin during those years was polite and distant. Birthday calls that lasted 9 minutes. Christmas messages sent by text. Occasional Sunday dinners when I happened to be in the same city, which wasn't often. I wasn't angry at them anymore, or at least, that's what I told myself. I had simply outgrown the need to seek their approval, and with that, outgrown the urgency of their presence. Renelle, my father's sister, would sometimes tell me I was being cold. That family was family. I would nod and change the subject. Renelle was warm on the surface in the way that some people are, generously, visibly, and in a way that made you feel slightly guilty for not matching it. I didn't know then what Renelle knew. I didn't know what any of them knew. I was living my quiet, disciplined, carefully constructed life on the 14th floor, drinking my 6 o'clock coffee, watching the city wake up below me, completely unaware that somewhere, in a bank I had never walked into, a document existed with my name on it. My signature, my future, and not a single letter of it written by my hand. The first sign was so small I almost missed it. That's the thing about betrayal when it comes from people who know you. They know exactly how to move inside your blind spots. It started with a phone call from Cortland, sometime in early spring, about 2 years before everything collapsed. He called on a Tuesday, which was unusual. Our calls had an unspoken rhythm, birthdays, holidays, the occasional Sunday. A Tuesday meant something was off, but I told myself I was being paranoid. He asked how work was going. I told him well. He asked, almost casually, almost as an afterthought, whether I was still with the same investment firm. I said yes. He said that was good, that it was smart to stay consistent. Then he said goodbye and hung up, and I stood in my kitchen for a moment with the phone still warm in my hand, trying to identify the feeling crawling up my spine. I couldn't name it then. Later, I would recognize it as a particular unease of someone who has just been surveyed without knowing it. Solvin called 3 weeks after that. She was warmer than usual, which should have been its own warning sign. My mother operated in a narrow emotional register, pleasant but measured, never effusive. That afternoon, she asked about my apartment, whether the first owned it or rented. I told her I owned it. She said she was glad, that it was important to have something real, something tangible. Then she mentioned, almost in passing, that they had been thinking about some renovations to the family house. That things were expensive, that it was hard getting older without the right kind of financial foundation. I listened, said the appropriate things, and felt nothing except a vague tiredness. I had heard variations of this conversation my entire adult life. I assumed it was what it always was, a soft bid for sympathy. Maybe a gentle preamble to asking for money I had no intention of lending. I did not send money. I did not hear from either of them again for nearly 6 weeks. When Renelle called, I almost didn't answer. It was a Saturday, and I was in the middle of reviewing quarterly reports with a glass of wine and no desire for family conversation. But I picked up because ignoring Renelle always costs more than answering her. She was cheerful and meandering in the way she always was, talking about her garden, about a neighbor's wedding, about the weather in the town where she and my father's family still lived. And then, smoothly, without any real shift in tone, she mentioned that she thought it was wonderful that I was helping my parents, that it showed real character, that not everyone would do something like that for their family. I asked her what she meant. She paused just a fraction of a second too long. Then she said she meant in general, that helping family, being there for them was just a beautiful thing. She steered the conversation back to her garden, and we hung up 15 minutes later on warm terms. I sat with that exchange for a long time. I turned it over the way you turn over a stone that looks ordinary but feels wrong, slightly too light, or too smooth, or placed too deliberately to be natural. I almost called Cortland that night. Almost. Instead, I opened my laptop and spent an hour reviewing every account I had access to, every document in my financial folder, every notification from every institution that held anything with my name on it. Everything looked normal. Everything looked exactly as I had left it. That was the thing. Whatever they had done it somewhere I wasn't looking. Over the following months, small things continued to accumulate. A moment at a Sunday dinner, one of the rare ones, where Cortland refilled his wine glass and said, without looking at me, that he was glad we were in this together now. I asked what he meant. He smiled and said family was always stronger when it moved as a unit. Salva nodded from across the table, with the serene expression of someone watching a plan unfold on schedule. I remember the way the candlelight moved across her face. I remember thinking she looked satisfied in a way that made me uneasy without knowing why. I told myself I was reading too much into things. I told myself that distance from my family had made me suspicious of ordinary warmth. I told myself that not every soft conversation was a manipulation, and not every vague comment was a threat. I was wrong on all 3 counts, but I had no way to prove it yet, and the people sitting across from me at that table were counting on exactly that. What I didn't know was that the documents had already been signed, that my name was already on a loan agreement I had never seen, in a bank I had never entered, for an amount that would have made my stomach drop if anyone had simply shown it to me directly. What I didn't know was that Renelle had already told to people who would eventually tell others, that I had agreed to help my parents, that it was a family arrangement, that Veradis was finally stepping up. The story was already moving. The architecture of the lie was already standing. I was the last person to find out, and I found out not from family, not from a confession, not from a slip of the tongue at a candlelit dinner table, but from a stranger's voice on the other end of a phone call I almost didn't answer. The call came on a Thursday morning in October. I remember the month because the trees outside my window had just started turning, and I had been in a good mood, the kind of quiet, unearned good mood that sometimes arrives on ordinary weekday mornings for no particular reason. Coffee was hot. My calendar was manageable. The light through the window was that specific amber that only happens in autumn, when the sun sits lower and everything it touches looks slightly warmer than it actually is. My phone rang at 8:47. Unknown number, local area code. I almost let it go to voicemail. I had a meeting in an hour, and I was still in my robe, and unknown numbers almost never carried anything worth interrupting a good morning for. But something I still can't explain what made me answer. The voice on the other end was professional and measured. He introduced himself as Oswin, a representative from a lending institution I had never done business with. He said he was calling regarding an outstanding balance associated with my name and my social security number. He said the account had been delinquent for 63 days. He asked if I was available to discuss repayment options. I said, very slowly, that I didn't know what he was talking about. There was a brief pause on his end. The kind of pause that happens when a professional is recalibrating, when the script they were following no longer quite fits the conversation. He read back my full name, my date of birth, my address at the time the loan was originated. All correct. Then he told me the amount. I won't say the exact number here, but I will say this. It was the kind of number that doesn't arrive in your life quietly. It arrives like something physical. Like a pressure drop. Like the moment on an airplane when turbulence shifts from uncomfortable to genuinely frightening. I sat down. I don't remember deciding to sit. I was simply standing, and then I was not. I asked him to repeat the amount. He did. I asked him when the loan had been originated. He told me. 14 months earlier. 14 months. I had been living my life, reviewing my quarterly reports, having my 9-minute birthday calls, and my rare Sunday dinners, completely unaware that for over a year, a debt existed in my name, accumulating interest, moving through its repayment schedule, and now, falling apart in a way that had landed on my phone on an Amber Thursday morning. I told Oswin, as calmly as I could manage, that I had never taken out this loan, that I had no knowledge of this account, that I had never signed any document with his institution. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that I have replayed many times since. He said, "Ma'am, the signature on file matches your legal name. There is also a secondary contact listed on the account. Would you like me to read you that name?" I said yes. He said the name. It was Cortland. The amber light through the window did not change. The coffee on my counter was still hot. The trees were still turning. Everything in my apartment looked exactly as it had 60 seconds earlier. And yet I was sitting in an entirely different life than the one I had woken up inside of that morning. I thanked Oswin, which, looking back, is an almost absurd thing to have done, and told him I would need to call him back. He gave me a reference number and a direct line and told me they were willing to work with me. On next steps, I wrote the number down on the back of an envelope. My handwriting was steady. I was surprised by that. Inside, something had gone very cold and very still, the way a room goes still just before a window breaks. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after the call ended. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I pulled out my laptop and began writing down everything I could remember, every odd phone call, every vague comment, every moment where something had felt slightly off, but I had chosen to explain away. Cortland asking about my investment firm. Sullivan asking whether I owned my apartment. Ronald's comment about how wonderful it was that I was helping my parents. The candlelit dinner. His voice saying we were in this together now. It wasn't paranoia. It never had been. It was evidence. Unorganized, unmarked, stored in the back of my mind like documents I hadn't known I would need. I had been surveyed, assessed, and used. My name, my credit, my years of careful and solitary work. All of it had been borrowed without my knowledge and spent without my consent. And the people who had done it were not strangers. They were the two people who had first taught me what it meant to feel financially powerless. And they had, apparently, decided to teach me that lesson one final time. I closed the laptop. I looked out at the amber light. And I made a decision, not in anger, not in tears, but in the cold and clarifying way that decisions sometimes arrive when you have finally, completely, run out of any reason left to give someone the benefit of the doubt. I was not going to resolve this quietly. I was not going to protect them. I was going to find out exactly what they had done, exactly how they had done it. And I was going to make sure that the truth had nowhere left to hide. I called Cortland that same evening. I had spent the hours between Oswin's call and dinner sitting with what I knew, organizing it, letting it settle into something solid before I picked up the phone. I didn't want to call from panic. I wanted to call from clarity. There is a difference, and the difference matters. Panic gives people room to maneuver, room to redirect and reframe and make you feel like the unstable one. Clarity doesn't give them that room. He answered on the second ring. His voice was easy, unhurried. The voice of a man who had not yet been told that the story was unraveling. I asked him how he was. He said fine, busy, the usual. I asked him if there was anything he needed to tell me. A pause, brief, but there, he said he didn't know what I meant. I told him I had received a phone call that morning from a lending institution, that they had my name on a loan agreement, that they had his name listed as a secondary contact. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before it. It had weight. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted. Not dramatically. Cortland never did anything dramatically. But the ease was gone, replaced by something more careful and deliberate. He said that he had meant to talk to me about that it was a complicated situation, that he had needed the money urgently, and had believed, genuinely believed, that I would have agreed if he had asked. I asked him why he hadn't asked. He said things were difficult to explain over the phone. I asked him when he was planning to tell me that my name, and my credit, and my financial future had been used as collateral for a loan I knew nothing about. He said I was being dramatic. That word, dramatic. I had heard it my entire life, deployed precisely in moments like this one, moments when a legitimate grievance threatened to become inconvenient for him. I let it pass. I told him I needed him to explain, clearly and completely, what had been signed and where and by whom. He told me that we should discuss it in person, that this was a family matter and family matters were handled face to face. I agreed to come, not because I trusted him, but because I wanted to see their faces. Solvin opened the door when I arrived 2 days later. She was dressed well, as always, a kind of quiet, practiced elegance that she wore like a second skin. She kissed my cheek. She offered me tea. The house smelled like it always had, that particular combination of good candles and old wood and something faintly floral that I had grown up associating with the feeling of walking on uneven ground. I sat at the kitchen table, where I had done homework as a child and waited. Cortland came in and sat across from me. He opened the conversation by telling me he loved me. I noted that. It was the first time in recent memory that he had led with that particular word, and the timing told me everything about why it was being used. What followed was 40 minutes of the most elaborate non-explanation I have ever sat through. He said the loan had been a necessity, an emergency renovation, a debt to a contractor, a situation that had spiraled faster than anticipated. He said he had tried to reach me, but I was always so busy, always so distant, always so focused on my own life that he hadn't wanted to burden me with a request. He assumed I would refuse. He said he had planned to repay it before I ever found out, that it was nearly resolved, that I was making something large out of something that was almost already handled. Solvin sat beside him and said nothing for most of it. When she did speak, she spoke softly, and with a kind of sorrow that looked genuine until you looked at her eyes. She said she hoped I could understand how hard things had been, that they were not young anymore, that they had not wanted to ask for help but had not known what else to do. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine, and I looked at her hand and thought about how many times that gesture had been used to communicate warmth and how hollow it felt now. That I understood what warmth in this house had always cost. I asked them directly, did they forge my signature? Cortland said that was a very strong word. I said it was the accurate word and I wanted an answer. Solvin looked at her tea. Cortland looked at me with an expression I recognized, the expression of a man deciding how much truth is safe to release. He said that someone had signed on my behalf, with the understanding that I would be informed and would have agreed. I asked who. He said it wasn't important. I said it was the only thing that was important. He told me to calm down. He told me this could still be resolved quietly, within the family, without involving anyone outside. That involving lawyers or banks would only make things worse for everyone, including me. That my credit was already attached to this, and the smartest thing I could do was cooperate, so they could fix it together. He used the word together 3 times and for sentences. I counted. I left without finishing the tea Solvin had poured. I drove home in silence, both hands on the wheel, watching the road with the focused attention of someone who needs an ordinary physical task to keep themselves anchored. When I got home, I sat on the floor of my living room, not the couch, the floor, and I let myself feel, for exactly 15 minutes, every single thing I had been holding in that kitchen. Then I stood up, washed my face, and began looking for a lawyer. Finding the right lawyer is not like finding a doctor or an accountant. With those, you look for credentials and availability and reasonable fees. With a lawyer, when the situation is what mine was, you are looking for something harder to quantify. You are looking for someone who will believe you before the evidence is assembled. Someone who can hear a story that sounds on its surface like a family misunderstanding and recognize underneath it the architecture of something deliberate and calculated. I had one consultation that left me feeling smaller than when I arrived. A second that was professional but distant. The kind of meeting where you can tell the person across the desk is already mentally sorting your case into a category before you finish your first sentence. Drevin was the third name on a list a colleague had quietly passed me when I mentioned, without much detail, that I needed legal advice on a financial matter. He had a small office on the second floor of a building that smelled like old paper and strong coffee, which I decided immediately was a good sign. He was not young, not old, somewhere in the middle, with the kind of face that doesn't perform reassurance but simply holds steady. He shook my hand and gestured to the chair across from his desk and said, "Tell me everything." And then he actually listened. I told him everything. I started with Osman's call and worked backward, the candle at dinner, Renel's comment, Solvin asking whether I owned my apartment, Cortland inquiring about my investment firm. I told him about the confrontation at the family house, about the 40 minutes of careful non-explanation, about the word together used 3 times and for sentences. I told him about Cortland's face when he said someone had signed on my behalf. I told him all of it, and when I finished, Drevin was quiet for a moment, looking at the notes he had taken. And then he looked up and said, "This is not a family misunderstanding. This is fraud." Something released in my chest when he said that word, not because it was a comfortable word, but because it was the correct one. and I had been surrounded for days by people working very hard to make sure. I never heard it spoken plainly. He explained what the process would look like. We would need to formally dispute the loan with the lending institution, file a report documenting the forgery, and build a paper trail that demonstrated I had no knowledge of or participation in the origination of the debt. He told me this would require documentation. Anything I had that established my financial behavior and history. Any records that showed I had never communicated with that institution. Any communications from my parents that could be relevant. He asked me if I had saved any of the messages from Cortland and Sullivan in the weeks and months before the loan was originated. I told him I saved everything. Old habit, a leftover instinct from growing up in a house where things said were later denied. He said that was very good. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted completely? Or someone you were simply expected to trust because of who they were? I think about that question often when I look back at this part of the story. Because what made this particular betrayal so disorienting wasn't just what they had done. It was the way they had done it, slowly, carefully, using my own absence as cover, and my own discipline as the thing worth stealing. They had watched me build something and decided it was available to them. Over the following 2 weeks, Drevin and I met for times. I brought him everything, bank statements going back 3 years, tax records, email threads, text messages, voicemails I had never deleted. He reviewed all of it with the methodical patience of someone who understood that cases like this are won not through dramatic revelation, but through the accumulation of detail. Each piece on its own meant little. Together, they told a story that was very difficult to argue against. The lending institution, once formally notified of the disputed signature, opened their own internal review. This was significant. It meant that the document at the center of everything, the loan agreement bearing what was supposed to be my signature, was now being examined by people whose job it was to determine its authenticity. Drevin told me this calmly, as a procedural update, but I could tell from the particular stillness in his expression that it was more than procedural. It was the moment the ground began to shift. Cortland called twice during this period. I did not answer. He left one voicemail, measured, almost gentle, saying he hoped we could still resolve things before they went too far, that there was still time to handle this the right way. I forwarded the voicemail to Drevin without responding. Sullivan sent a text that said simply that she missed me and hoped I was well. I read it once and set the phone down and felt something I couldn't immediately name. Not anger, not sadness exactly, but a kind of profound tiredness at the performance of it. At the continued insistence, even now, on presenting a surface that bore no relationship to what was underneath. Renelle, I later learned, had by this point told at least for people in the extended family that I had agreed to the loan, but was now getting cold feet, that I was causing unnecessary trouble over something that had already been arranged. That Veradis had always been difficult, had always pulled away, and this was just the latest version of that pattern. I didn't know the full extent of what she was saying until later, but I felt it in the silence from cousins, who didn't call, in a great-aunt's message that said she hoped I would think carefully before hurting my parents. The narrative was already moving through the family like water finding its level, and I was not the one who had opened the tap. The weeks that followed were the hardest of the entire ordeal, harder in some ways than the call from Oswin, harder than the confrontation at the family house, because at least in those moments I had the clarity of fresh shock to carry me forward. What came next was something slower and more erosive. It was the sustained pressure of people who love you, or who claim to, working methodically to wear you down. Renelle called on a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks into the legal process. She opened warmly, as always, asking about my health, mentioning something funny that had happened at a family gathering I hadn't attended. Then, with the same seamless transition she always used, she shifted. She said she was worried about me, that she had been hearing things that concerned her, that people in the family were confused and hurt, and that she felt, as someone who loved both me and my parents, that she needed to say something. She said that whatever had been agreed to or not agreed to, dragging the family into a legal situation was going to cause damage that couldn't be undone. That courts didn't understand family. That judges saw paper, not history, not love, not the complexity of what it meant to be someone's child. I let her talk. I had learned, by then, that interrupting Renelle was less effective than letting her reach the end of her own momentum. When she finished, I told her calmly that I had not agreed to anything, that my signature had been used without my knowledge, and that I was doing what any person in my position would do. She made a sound, not quite a sigh, not quite a dismissal, something in between, and said she hoped I was sure about what I remembered. That memory was a complicated thing, that sometimes we convinced ourselves of versions of events that felt true, but weren't quite accurate. That sentence. I have thought about it many times since. It was so precisely calibrated, not a direct accusation, not a provable lie, just a seed of doubt planted with the gentle authority of a concerned aunt. It was, I realized, exactly the kind of thing she had probably been saying to everyone else. Not that Veradis was lying, just that Veradis might be mistaken, just that memory was complicated, just enough to make people hesitate before believing me. The extended family pressure arrived in waves after that. A cousin sent a long message explaining that our grandparents had always believed family protected family, and that she hoped I would reflect on what that meant. Uncle, someone I had not spoken to in 4 years, called to say that Cortland was not a young man anymore and that whatever had happened, public legal action seemed like an extreme response. Each message was different in its specifics and identical in its structure, a reminder of family loyalty, a gentle suggestion that I was overreacting, and an implicit invitation to stand down. I almost called Drevin one evening to ask him how much it would cost to make it stop. Not to drop the case, but to ask genuinely whether there was a version of this that could be resolved short of a courtroom. Whether there was a settlement that would protect my credit and my financial standing, without requiring me to sit across from my parents in front of a judge. I stood in my kitchen with my phone in my hand for a long time. I thought about how tired I was. I thought about the cousin's message and the uncle's call and Renel's carefully placed doubt. I thought about how much easier it would be to simply absorb the damage and move on, the way I had absorbed so many smaller damages over the years. Then I thought about Cortland's face when he said someone had signed on my behalf. The careful non-admission. The performance of regret without any actual accountability. I thought about Sullivan's hand over mine, and her eyes looking at her tea. I thought about the word together, used 3 times in 4 sentences, to describe a situation I had never been invited into. I put the phone down without calling anyone. I made tea instead. I stood at my window and watched the city below me, the lights coming on as the evening settled in, the ordinary movement of ordinary people living their ordinary lives, and I thought about the 14th-floor apartment I had bought with my own money, the portfolio I had built with my own discipline, the silence I had learned to love. I thought about what it had cost to build all of that, and I decided, again, in the same cold and clarifying way I had decided before, that I was not going to let the weight of other people's guilt become my responsibility to carry. I texted Drevin the next morning. I told him I was ready to proceed. He responded within the hour. 2 words, clean and steady, good, let's. The forensic analysis of the signature had come back. The lending institution's internal review had produced findings they were prepared to present. The documentation I had gathered across weeks of careful, unhurried work was organized and ready. The case that Cortland and Sullivan had assumed would never be built, because they had assumed I would be too guilty, too tired, too entangled in the mythology of family obligation to build it, was complete. They had one more move left. Cortland called the night before the first court date. His voice, for the first time in my memory, had lost its composure entirely. He said my name twice before he said anything else. He said he was asking me, as my father, to reconsider. That what was about to happen would change things permanently. That there was still time. I listened to him breathing on the other end of the line, unsteady, effortful, and I thought about the 14 months I had unknowingly carried a debt I never agreed to. I thought about Oswin's voice on an amber Thursday morning. I thought about how long permanently actually was. I said goodnight. I hung up. I set my alarm for 7 and went to bed. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined. I don't know what I had been expecting. Something grander, perhaps, something proportional to the size of what had been done to me. Instead, it was a medium-sized room with fluorescent lighting and wooden benches that looked like they had absorbed decades of other people's difficult days. It smelled like recycled air and old paper. There was nothing dramatic about the physical space itself, and somehow that made it feel more serious, not less. This was not a stage. This was a room where ordinary, irrevocable things happened. Drevin and I arrived early. He was in his good suit, not showy, just solid. The visual equivalent of his entire professional manner. He reviewed his notes one final time at the table, unhurried, and I sat beside him and looked straight ahead and breathed. I had slept surprisingly well the night before. I think my body understood that the time for lying awake had passed. Everything that could be done had been done. What remained was simply to be present for what came next. Cortland and Sullivan arrived with their own attorney, a younger man I didn't recognize, who carried himself with the particular confidence of someone who had not yet seen the full weight of what he was walking into. Cortland was dressed carefully, formally, in a way that telegraphed respectability. Sullivan wore something dark and understated. They sat at their table and did not look at me. Or rather, Sullivan did not look at me. Cortland looked once, briefly, with an expression I could not fully read, not quite guilt, not quite defiance. Something in between, something unresolved, something that belonged to a man who had spent his entire life expecting situations to resolve in his favor and was only now beginning to suspect that this one might not. Judge Harlan entered and the room recalibrated around him immediately. He was not a large man, not a theatrical one. He moved to the bench with the economy of motion of someone who had done this thousands of times and found no reason to perform it. He sat. He reviewed the documents before him in silence for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then he looked up and his gaze moved across the room with the same impartiality that his entire presence communicated, not cold exactly, but sealed, unmovable. The kind of authority that doesn't need to announce itself. The proceedings moved with a formality that I found steadying rather than intimidating. Drevin presented our case with the same methodical patience he had brought to every meeting. In his second-floor office, no theatrics, no emotional appeals. Simply the careful and sequential presentation of evidence, the forensic analysis of the signature, the timeline of the loan origination against my documented whereabouts, and communications. The records that showed I had never contacted the lending institution, never received correspondence at my address, never participated in any stage of the process that bore my name. The voicemail from Cortland, forwarded without response, in which he asked me to resolve things before they went too far, a sentence that only made sense if there was something to resolve. The opposing counsel attempted several reframings. That the signature discrepancy was a clerical matter. That there had been a genuine misunderstanding about consent within the family. That Veradis had been aware of the loan in a general sense, even if the specifics had not been formally communicated. Each attempt landed and was addressed, cleanly and without drama, by the documentation that made each alternative explanation structurally impossible. I watched Judge Harlan's face through all of it. It did not change. It simply received. When Cortland was asked directly whether he had authorized the signing of my name on the loan document, he said that he had believed it was within his rights as a parent to act in the family's interest. Judge Harlan looked at him for a moment after that answer, just a moment, and wrote something down. That was all. But something in the room shifted when he wrote it, the way pressure shifts before weather changes. The deliberation was not long. When Judge Harlan returned and the room was settled into its formal stillness, I was aware of my own breathing in a way I hadn't been before. Not from fear. I had moved past fear, somewhere in the middle of Drevin's presentation. When I had watched the evidence do what evidence does when it is true and complete and assembled with care. I was aware of my breathing simply because everything felt very present, very specific. The way moments do when you understand that you are inside one that will not repeat. The ruling was clear, and it was final. The loan, originated through fraudulent means using a forged signature, was not my liability. The financial institution's claim against me was dismissed. Cortland and Sullivan were found liable for the full amount. Their attorney's face told me everything about how unexpected this outcome was for the version of the story they had been prepared to tell. Cortland sat very still. Sullivan looked at the table. Judge Harlan's voice did not rise or fall throughout the entire delivery. It remained exactly as it had been from the beginning, level and irrevocable. The voice of a room where ordinary, permanent things happened. I did not feel triumph. I want to be honest about that, because triumph is what people expect from moments like this one. And I think the expectation misunderstands what it actually feels like to win something you should never have had to fight for. What I felt was quieter than triumph and more durable. I felt the particular stillness of a person who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has finally, with both hands, set it down. Drevin touched my arm briefly as we gathered our things. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. We walked out of that medium-sized room with the fluorescent lighting and the wooden benches, and the door closed behind us, and the air in the hallway was cooler and smelled like nothing at all, and I stood in it for a moment and simply breathed. That was 2 years ago. I am telling you this now from the same 14th floor apartment, with the same coffee at 6 in the morning, watching the same city wake up below me. Some things have changed. Most things, the things that matter, have stayed exactly as I built them. My credit was restored. The formal documentation of the fraud was thorough enough that the process, while not instant, was clean. Drevin handled the final details with the same steady competence he had brought to everything else, and when it was fully resolved, he sent me a brief email that ended with the words, "You did the hard part." I printed that email. It is in a folder I don't open often but know exactly where to find. The financial consequences for Cortland and Sullivan were significant and real. I won't detail all of it here, because the specifics belong to a Chapter 1 have chosen not to live inside anymore. What I will say is this: the loan they had taken in my name, the debt they had assumed I would absorb or that they would quietly resolve before I ever found out, became entirely and formally their own. The renovation they had claimed to need was never completed. The house, which Cortland had treated his entire life as a monument to his own solidity, was eventually sold under circumstances that were not voluntary. I know this not because I monitored them, but because some information simply finds its way to you whether you seek it or not. Ronell stopped calling after the ruling. I noticed the silence and felt nothing particular about it, not satisfaction, not loss. Just the acknowledgement of a pattern completing itself. The cousins who had sent messages about family loyalty also went quiet. The uncle who had called to suggest my response was extreme did not call again. The extended family, which had arranged itself so confidently around the narrative that Veradis was causing unnecessary trouble, simply redistributed itself around a different configuration of silence. Families are good at that. At reorganizing the furniture of a story so that the uncomfortable pieces face a wall. I think about Oswin sometimes, the bank representative who called on that Amber Thursday morning and unknowingly handed me the thread that unraveled everything. I hope he is well. I hope he knows, in whatever general way a person can know something like this, that the phone call he made as a routine professional task mattered more than routine tasks usually do. There is something I find quietly remarkable about the fact that the entire architecture of what my parents had built, for months of careful concealment, of cultivated narrative, of family pressure and managed appearances, came apart because of a stranger doing his job. I have not spoken to Cortland or Sullivan since the ruling. This is not a dramatic estrangement. There was no final confrontation, no letter, no closing statement. I simply stopped. The way you stop doing something that has cost you far more than it has ever returned. The distance that I have maintained for years out of emotional self-preservation became, after everything, a distance I maintained out of simple clarity. I do not wish them harm. I do not spend time constructing feelings about them one way or another. They are people who made choices, and those choices had consequences, and I was not willing to absorb those consequences on their behalf. That is the whole of it. What I did not expect. What I could not have predicted during the hardest weeks, when Ronell was planting doubt and the family was sending its careful messages, and I was standing in my kitchen wondering how much more I could hold, was how light I would feel on the other side. Not happy in a simple or uncomplicated way, but light. The particular lightness of a person who has stopped carrying something they were never responsible for carrying in the first place. I rebuilt nothing because nothing had been destroyed. That is perhaps the most important thing I want you to take from this. The portfolio was intact. The apartment was mine. The work of 7 years of discipline and solitude and early mornings had not been undone. It had simply been threatened, and the threat had been met, and the foundation had held. I had built something that could not be taken from me, and when someone tried to take it anyway, I had the presence of mind and the legal support and the accumulated documentation to prove exactly what was mine. Some mornings I sit at this window, and I think about the version of myself who almost didn't fight, who almost resolved it quietly within the family the way Cortland had asked, who almost let the weight of guilt and exhaustion and Ronell's carefully worded doubt convince her that keeping the peace was worth more than keeping the truth. I think about her with something close to tenderness. She was tired in ways that are hard to explain to someone who hasn't lived inside that particular kind of family, but she made the right call. She sat on the floor of her living room for exactly 15 minutes and felt everything. And then she stood up and washed her face and found a lawyer. Before I go, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want to know your answer. If you had been in Veradis' position, if the people who were supposed to protect you had instead used you, and then asked you to stay quiet about it for the sake of the family, what would you have done? Leave your answer in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if this story stayed with you, you already know why. Peace, when you finally earn it back, feels different from any peace you've ever known. It has texture. It has weight. It is the peace of someone who looked directly at an unbearable thing and did not look away. I am Veradis, and I am well.